A cistern is a room that holds water. Take the water away and you are left with a room. This is not a metaphor. It is a fact of construction that every stonemason on the American frontier understood, and that most farmers forgot the moment the cistern stopped holding water, which happened often enough that the countryside was littered with them. Dry stone chambers sunk into hillsides and buried under barn floors and hidden beneath kitchen gardens. Their walls still sound, their mortar still tight, their only deficiency the one thing that had defined their purpose, which was the water they no longer contained. The cistern on the Marlowe property in Barron County, Kentucky, was built in 1841 by a mason named Seward, who charged $14 for the work and who built it the way he built everything, which was too well. The chamber was 10 feet in diameter and 9 feet deep, circular with walls of cut limestone blocks laid in lime mortar 2 feet thick. The floor was flagstone, flat slabs of the same limestone fitted tight and sealed with mortar until the surface was as smooth and waterproof as a dinner plate. The ceiling was a corbelled dome, each course of stone projecting slightly inward from the one below until the courses met at the top in a capstone that closed the dome like a cork in a bottle. The dome was 2 feet thick at the base and 18 inches at the crown, and it supported the weight of 4 feet of earth above it, without timber, without iron, without anything except the geometry of the arch, which is the oldest structural principle in the world and the most reliable. The cistern held water for 32 years. In 1873, the limestone bed that fed the spring cracked during a drought, and the water table shifted 6 feet east, and the cistern went dry. The Marlowe family, who had used it as their primary water source for 3 decades, dug a new well, abandoned the chamber, and forgot about it, the way people forget about anything that stops being useful completely within a season. Verity Marlowe did not forget because Verity Marlowe had nowhere else to go. She was 20 years old on the morning of the 15th of March, 1885. She stood in the front room of the Marlowe farmhouse with a canvas bag at her feet, and she listened to her mother-in-law give her orders for the last time. The bag contained her clothes, a wool blanket, a cast-iron pot, a sewing basket, and the family Bible that had belonged to her mother. Drusilla Marlowe had tried to keep the Bible that morning because Drusilla kept everything, and the Bible had been on the mantle for 11 months, and Drusilla had come to think of it as hers. Verity had taken it anyway. It was the only argument she won that day, and she won it by reaching past Drusilla and lifting the book from the mantle without asking, and by walking out of the room before Drusilla could gather the words to say no. She was 5 feet 4 inches tall. She was slight but wiry. She had straw-colored hair that she wore in 2 braids pinned across the top of her head like a crown. Her eyes were pale blue and went wide when she was surprised and narrow when she was thinking. She had a small straight nose and a mouth that curved naturally upward at the corners so that she looked like she was about to smile even when she was not. Her hands were quick and clever. They were the hands of a quilter, which she had been since she was 7 years old, and the hands of a gardener, which she had been since she could walk. On this morning, the hands were steady, which surprised her because she had expected them to shake. 11 months. She had been a Marlowe for 11 months. She had come to the farm on the 15th of April, 1884, in a borrowed wagon with Alden Marlowe driving, and his mother sitting in the seat beside him, and his father riding a gray horse behind, and she had come through the front door of this house carrying the same canvas bag she was carrying out of it now. 11 months. She had tried in every way she knew how. She had cooked at 4 in the morning and scrubbed floors at 10 at night and learned the Marlowe preferences for every meal of every day of every week. She had gone to the Baptist church at Turkey Creek on Sundays, with her hair pinned tighter than she wore it the rest of the week because Drusilla preferred it that way, and she had not spoken to the other women in the congregation unless they spoke to her first because Drusilla preferred that as well. She had prayed for a child. She had prayed on her knees beside the bed with Alden already asleep beside her, his breathing slow and regular and unconcerned. She had prayed in the root cellar when she went down for potatoes. She had prayed in the orchard behind the barn when she went to gather what was left of the wild apples. She had prayed in the terms a young wife prays in when she has been told on her wedding day that her worth will be measured by what her body produces and not by what her mind or her hands can do. The prayers had not been answered. 11 months of a marriage bed, and the body had not done what the body was expected to do, and Drusilla Marlowe, who had borne 6 children and regarded fertility as a moral achievement rather than a biological event, had begun to count the months allowed at supper in the way a bookkeeper counts overdue accounts. Verity had known the reckoning was coming. She had not known what form it would take. She had thought in the worst of her imaginings that Drusilla would send her to a midwife in Glasgow, or would require her to take some foul tea, or would simply extend the counting month after month until Verity's own courage gave out and she went home to her people in Metcalfe County. She had not imagined what had in fact been done, which she learned only in pieces in the days before the 15th of March, and in full on the morning of the 14th, when she was laying a fire in the kitchen stove, and she heard Drusilla speaking in the parlor to Alden's aunt, who had come out from town. Drusilla said the arrangements had been made before Christmas. Drusilla said the Bowen family in Glasgow had been approached through a cousin in November. Drusilla said Constance Bowen was a fine, strong girl of 17 with 3 older sisters who had between them produced 11 children, and that the Bowen family had agreed to the match in principle in December, pending only the removal of the current Mrs. Marlowe. Drusilla said the removal would be handled in the second week of March, and that by the end of April, Alden would be engaged to Constance, and by the harvest he would be married. Verity stood by the kitchen stove with a pine splinter in her hand and a small flame building in the grate, and she listened to her own life being discussed in the next room as a problem that had been solved by appointment 3 months in advance. She did not drop the splinter. She did not cry. She did not go into the parlor. She laid the splinter in the flame, and she closed the stove door, and she walked to the window above the sink, and she looked out at the March yard, and she understood in a way that was beyond speech that she had been dead to this house since December, and that the 11 months she had thought she was living had ended in the first week of winter, and that what she had been doing since then was keeping house for a ghost. She finished the fire, she made the coffee, she made the biscuits, she served the breakfast, she washed the plates. She did all of this because she had not yet decided what else to do, and because the doing of familiar things was the only way she knew to keep her hands from shaking hard enough for Drusilla to see. Drusilla had told her at 3 in the afternoon on the 14th of March that she was to leave the following morning. Drusilla had said it in the kitchen at the table where Verity had eaten 3 meals a day for 11 months. Drusilla had said it without sitting down. Drusilla had said it with the particular flat efficiency of a woman who had written the speech out in her head so many times that the delivery had gone smooth. Drusilla had said the arrangement has not worked. We have made other plans. You will pack your things tonight, and you will be gone before the sun is high tomorrow. You may take what you brought. You may not take anything that was given to you by this family. Alden will not be at the house in the morning. He has been sent to Glasgow on business. You are to be gone when he returns. Verity had looked at Drusilla across the kitchen table, and she had waited for her own throat to produce some sound, and no sound had come. She had nodded once. She had turned and she had walked up the stairs to the bedroom she shared with Alden, and she had packed her canvas bag, and she had sat on the edge of the bed until Alden came up at 9 in the evening, and she had waited for him to speak. He had not spoken. He had known. It was clear from the way he did not look at her, from the way he sat on his side of the bed with his shoulders turned inward, from the way his breathing went shallow, the moment he lay down beside her, that he had known before supper, possibly before noon, possibly for weeks. He had not protested to his mother. He had not ridden to Glasgow to break off whatever had been arranged with the Bowens. He had not in 11 months of marriage once stood between Verity and his mother on any matter of substance, and he was not going to begin standing between them now. She had lain in the dark beside him. She had listened to him pretend to sleep. She had counted the breaths he took, and she had known by the rhythm of them that he was awake and that he was going to remain awake beside her without speaking until she got up in the morning and left. She had counted at one point to 1,000, at another to 3,000. Somewhere past 4,000 she had stopped counting. At dawn she rose. She dressed in the gray wool traveling dress she had been married in. She pinned her braids across her head. She picked up the canvas bag. She walked down the stairs. Drusilla was in the kitchen. Alden was not in the kitchen. Alden was, she understood, without needing to confirm it, in the barn where he had gone before first light to avoid being in the house when she came down. Drusilla handed her a biscuit wrapped in a square of cloth, and she said, "Good luck to you, Verity." Verity did not answer. She took the biscuit. She opened the front door. She stepped out into the raw March wind, and she closed the door behind her. She stood on the porch for perhaps 30 seconds. The thermometer beside the door read 36 degrees. The wind was coming out of the northwest hard and unsteady, carrying the smell of mud and old snow and wood smoke from the kitchen chimney behind her. She could have gone down the front path to the road. She could have walked the 6 miles to the stage stop at Mary Oaks and caught the eastbound coach to Glasgow, and from Glasgow she could have written to her brother in Metcalfe County and waited for him to come. That was the plan Drusilla had assumed she would follow, because it was the plan a sensible 20-year-old woman would follow, and Drusilla had spent 11 months assuming Verity was sensible. Verity did not go down the front path. She went around the side of the house. She walked past the smokehouse. She walked past the woodpile. She walked past the hen house with its chickens gathered in a muttering group at the door waiting for someone to let them out. She walked past the barn, and when she passed the barn, she heard Alden inside it, heard the sound of him not moving, the sound of a man who was standing very still because he was listening for the sound of his wife leaving and did not want to make a sound of his own that would let her know he was listening. She kept walking. She walked past the hog pen. She walked through the old orchard where the apple trees had gone half wild, their branches gray and bare in the March light. She climbed the low hill behind the orchard. Halfway up the hill, she stopped. She had not been on this part of the farm in 11 months. Drusilla had told her on her third day at the Marlowe place that the back of the property was no concern of a daughter-in-law, and Verity had understood that to mean she was not to go there, and she had not gone. But she had looked at it from the bedroom window every morning. She had looked at it while she pinned her hair. She had looked at the slight depression in the middle of the slope and at the stone shaft that rose 2 feet above the surface of the depression, capped with a flat limestone slab. She had asked Alden about it once in the first week, and he had said it was the old cistern and that it had gone dry when his father was a boy and that no one used it anymore. And then he had changed the subject because he did not like talking about the property, and he did not like talking about his father's boyhood, and he did not like talking about anything that would require him to hold an opinion. She stood now on the slope in the March wind, and she looked at the stone shaft 40 feet above her, and she saw something she had never seen from the bedroom window. In the gray light of the early morning, with the temperature at 36 and the wind cutting across the face of the hill, a thin column of vapor rose from the capstone of the cistern shaft. It rose perhaps 6 inches before the wind broke it apart. It was not steam. It was not smoke. It was the visible difference between the warm air rising through the small gap at the edge of the capstone and the cold air of the March morning. Verity looked at the vapor for a long time. She had grown up in Metcalfe County on a farm with a spring house, and she knew the look of warm breath coming out of cold stone. Warm breath came out of cold stone when the space inside the stone was warmer than the air outside it, and the space inside stone was warmer than the air outside it. In the middle of March in Kentucky, only if the space was deep enough to reach the constant temperature of the earth, which was a temperature her father had taught her to think of as the temperature of the well, because a well in this country ran at 52 degrees year-round, regardless of what the sky was doing. She climbed the rest of the slope. She set her canvas bag down beside the shaft. She knelt. She put her hand on the capstone. The capstone was cold on its upper surface, but around the edges where the warm air was escaping, it was almost room temperature. And where her fingers touched the mortar seam between the capstone and the shaft wall, she could feel the warmth coming up through the gap like the warmth from the back of a stove. She set her shoulder against the capstone. She pushed. The stone was heavy, perhaps 120 pounds, but it sat flat on the rim of the shaft, and it was designed to be lifted rather than pried. She worked it up on one edge with her fingers rocked. It got her palm under the raised edge, and walked the stone off the rim by turning it on its axis until it slid clear and thumped onto the grass beside her. She looked down into the shaft. The shaft was 3 feet across a clean circle of fitted limestone, and it dropped 9 feet to a flagstone floor. She could see the floor because the morning light fell straight down the shaft in a column of pale silver. The column of light ended on the flagstone in a perfect disk. Around the edge of the disk, the floor of the chamber extended out into darkness. She could not see the walls of the chamber from directly above because the shaft opening was narrower than the chamber below. But she could see the shadow of the core-bell dome curving outward from the rim of the shaft, and she could smell what came up out of the opening in a slow, steady current of air. The smell was not the smell she had expected. It was not damp or mildewed or stagnant. It was the smell of stone and old minerals and the deep earth, the smell of a room that had been closed for 12 years and that still remembered what it had been built to hold. It was a clean smell, a dry smell, a smell that did not belong to a hole in the ground, but to a house that had been shut up for the winter and was waiting for someone to come back. She sat on the grass beside the open shaft. She looked down into the chamber for perhaps 10 minutes. She let the warm air come up out of the ground and move against her face, and she let herself feel what 12 years of constant 52 degrees felt like compared to a March wind at 36, and she understood before she had moved from the grass that she was not going to the stage stop at Mary Oaks. She was not going to Glasgow. She was not going home to Metcalfe County. She was going down. She had no ladder. She had a rope in her canvas bag, a 20-foot length of hemp her mother had put in the bag with her wedding things 4 years before because her mother had been a woman who believed a young wife should have rope, and Verity had never asked what kind of wife her mother had imagined would need 20 feet of rope, and she was glad now that she had not asked. She tied one end of the rope to the trunk of a young locust tree that stood 6 feet from the shaft, and she tested the knot with her weight, and she lowered the free end down into the shaft and watched it uncoil across the flagstone floor 9 feet below. She took off the canvas bag. She tied the bag to the rope by its drawstring 3 feet below her hand grip, and she lowered the bag ahead of her. She heard the bag settle on the stone floor. She pulled back the rope. She took hold of the rope in both hands. She swung her legs over the edge of the shaft, and she went down hand over hand, bracing her feet against the limestone wall of the shaft, easing her weight down the 9 feet in 12 careful steps. Her feet touched flagstone. She let go of the rope. She stood in the center of the chamber, and she turned slowly in a complete circle. The chamber was 10 feet across. The walls rose around her in a perfect circle of fitted limestone blocks laid in lime mortar, the joints still tight after 44 years. Above her, the core-belled dome rose in diminishing circles of stone to the capstone, 9 feet above the floor. The capstone now lit at its center by the open shaft. The shaft, a column of pale silver light coming straight down into the middle of the chamber. The light fell on the flagstone floor and spread outward in a disk of pale gray, and the walls of the chamber stood in the deeper shadow at the edges of the disk, and the whole room was lit, the way a room is lit by a single candle set in the center of a dinner table at night, except that the candle was the sun. The temperature was the first thing she felt after the light. The 36 degrees of the March morning was gone. The air on her skin was cool but not cold. She had no thermometer with her, but she had spent enough time in her father's spring house to know 50 degrees when she felt it, and this was close to 50, perhaps a little above, perhaps exactly 52, which was what a well ran at in this country in every season. 16 degrees warmer than the air 10 feet above her head. No fire, no heat source, nothing but the earth itself holding its own temperature against the weather. The second thing she felt was the silence. 2 feet of stone wall and 4 feet of earth above absorbed every sound from the surface. The wind was gone, the birds were gone, the distant lowing of the Marlow cattle was gone, the creak of the barn door, the voice of Drusilla Marlowe giving orders to Alden in the yard, all of it gone. The cistern was as quiet as the inside of a closed hand, and the quiet was not emptiness. The quiet was presence. The presence of stone around her on all sides, holding her the way water holds a fish, completely, without effort, without end. She stood in the center of the chamber for a long time. She did not sit down. She did not touch the walls. She stood with her arms at her, and she let the silence settle on her, and she let the warmth of the earth move against her, and she felt her breathing slow for the first time in a month. She had not cried when Drusilla told her to leave. She had not cried when she heard the arrangement with the Bowens being discussed in the parlor. She had not cried in the night when Alden lay beside her, pretending to sleep. She had not cried on the porch in the March wind with the biscuit in her hand. She cried now. She cried standing in the middle of a stone chamber 9 feet below the ground, lit by a column of silver light surrounded by silence. And she cried for perhaps 5 minutes, and no one heard her because no one on the surface of the earth could have heard her through 2 feet of stone and 4 feet of packed earth, and no one on the surface of the earth knew she was down there. When she was done, she wiped her face on the sleeve of her traveling dress. She picked up her canvas bag from where it had landed on the flagstone. She walked the perimeter of the chamber, running her hand along the limestone wall, feeling the smoothness of the cut stone and the cold straight lines of the mortar joints. She looked at the dome above her and counted the courses. There were 16 courses between the top of the wall and the capstone, each one projecting perhaps 2 inches inward from the course below, each one laid by a man who had known what he was doing and had not cut a single corner. At the base of the southwest wall, she found the mason's mark cut into a single stone with a chisel, the way masons had been signing their work since the cathedrals. The letter S. Seward, 1841. A man who had charged $14 for this room and had built it the way a man builds a thing that is going to outlive his grandchildren. She sat down on the flagstone floor. She opened the canvas bag. She took out the wool blanket. She spread the blanket on the stone in the center of the chamber, in the disk of silver light coming down from the shaft. She took out the cast iron pot. She took out the sewing basket. She took out the family Bible, the one Drusilla had tried to keep. She laid each of these things in a row on the blanket. She looked at them. She had in the world a blanket, a pot, a basket, a book, and the dress she was wearing. She was 20 years old. She had no husband who would defend her. She had no child to answer to. She had no home but the one she was sitting in, which was a chamber 10 feet across and 9 feet deep, built by a dead man for a purpose that had ended 12 years ago. She was going to stay. She understood this as a settled fact. She did not debate it with herself. She did not list the reasons. She had decided it the moment she saw the column of vapor rising from the capstone, and she was not going to undecide it now that she had climbed down into the chamber and found it warm and dry and silent and sound. The cistern was a room. The room would hold her the way it had once held water. It would not leak. It would not fail. It would not send her away because the body she had not yet produced a child from. She stood up. She tied her canvas bag back to the rope. She climbed the rope hand over hand back up the shaft. She came out into the wind and the gray light, and she set the capstone back over the opening because leaving the opening exposed would have let the rain in and let the warmth out, and she was going to need the warmth. She shouldered her bag. She walked down the hill. She did not go back to the Marlowe farmhouse. She cut across the pasture to the west, through a break in the rail fence, and she walked 3/4 of a mile along the creek until she came to the Grimes place. Obadiah Grimes was 71 years old that spring. He was a thin man with a white beard cut square at the jaw and a pair of gray wool trousers held up by suspenders, older than his grandson. He had been a stonemason as a young man. He had worked on the courthouse in Glasgow in 1838, and he had worked on 3 churches between there and Bowling Green in the years that followed, and he had worked in 1841 as the journeyman assistant to a master mason named Seward on a small job on a farm in Barron County, building a cistern for a family named Marlowe. He had been 27 years old that year. He had helped lay every course of the Corbell dome. He had mixed the mortar. He had set the capstone himself under Seward's direction. Verity did not know any of this. Obadiah had never spoken of it to anyone because Obadiah was a man who had come to believe over the course of 7 decades that most things in this life were best handled by not speaking of them. He was splitting stove wood beside his house when Verity walked up his lane. He set the axe head down on the chopping block. He watched her come. He took in the canvas bag on her shoulder and the traveling dress and the pinned braids and the particular way a young woman walks when she has made a decision she is not going to discuss. He waited until she stopped at the edge of his yard. She said, "Mr. Grimes, I need to borrow a sledgehammer." He looked at her for perhaps 5 seconds. He did not ask what she needed it for. He did not ask where she was living. He did not ask whether she had left the Marlowe place, though he knew because everyone in Barron County knew by noon of the 15th that the young Marlowe woman had been put out, because Drusilla Marlowe was not a woman who could hold a piece of news for longer than half a morning. He nodded once. He walked to his tool shed. He came back with a sledgehammer. 12-pound head hickory handle, 40 inches long. He handed it to her. She said, "Thank you, I will bring it back." He said, "No hurry." She walked back the way she had come. She crossed the pasture. She climbed the hill behind the orchard. She stood beside the capstone with the sledgehammer in her hand. She looked down the south face of the hill to the place where the hillside fell away sharply toward the creek bottom, where the earth cover above the cistern wall would be thinnest. She calculated 3 feet of wall, perhaps 2 feet of earth above it on that face, possibly less. Tunnel cut through the hillside from the south face angled slightly upward would meet the chamber wall at floor level. She would need to break through the wall from outside. She would need to do it without collapsing the dome. She would need the sledgehammer for the wall and a pick for the earth, and she had neither a pick nor a shovel, and she was going to have to borrow those too, and Obadiah Grimes was going to lend them to her, and he was not going to ask her what she needed them for. She set the sledgehammer down beside the capstone. She walked back down to the Grimes place. That evening, when she had finished marking the line of the tunnel with the stick along the south face of the hill, when she had come down once more to fetch a pick and a long-handled shovel from Obadiah's shed, when she had climbed the hill for the fourth time and set her tools in a neat row beside the stone shaft, and had eaten the biscuit Drusilla had given her at dawn, and had opened the capstone and lowered her bag and climbed down into the chamber and laid her wool blanket on the flagstone and lain down on it in the disk of fading silver light, she heard a sound from the surface, a small thump, the sound of a heavy object being set down on the grass above her. She climbed the rope. She came up out of the shaft. The sun was almost down. The hillside was empty. There was no one in sight. But at the base of the stone shaft, just outside the circle of disturbed grass where she had stood that morning, 3 things had been placed on the ground in a small, neat pile. A coil of iron nails in a paper twist, perhaps 40 nails, the kind used for hanging things on stone walls. A tin lantern with a glass chimney and a small reservoir of oil. And a piece of smoked ham wrapped in waxed cloth, perhaps 2 pounds enough for a week if eaten carefully. She stood beside the pile in the last light. She looked down the hill toward the Grimes place. She could see the roof of the Grimes house through the trees and the smoke from the Grimes chimney, and she could see no figure walking anywhere between the Grimes house and the hill. Whoever had brought the 3 things had come and gone without being seen, and was not going to come forward now to be thanked. She picked up the nails and the lantern and the ham. She lowered them into the shaft ahead of her on the rope. She climbed back down. She set the lantern on the flagstone. She lit it with a match from her sewing basket. The chamber filled with soft yellow light that caught the curves of the corbelled dome and the mortar lines of the wall and the silver flash of the nails in their paper twist. And she sat on the wool blanket with a lantern burning at her feet and the ham wrapped in its cloth beside her. And she understood that somewhere in the world there was an old man who had decided, without having been asked and without intending to say a word about it, now or ever, that she was going to be allowed to build what she had come to build, and that he was going to help her build it, and that his help would take the form of things appearing on the grass at dusk. She did not go up the ladder that night. She did not set the capstone back in place. She left the shaft open for the air. She lay on the wool blanket on the flagstone floor of the stone chamber, and she watched the square of darkening sky at the top of the shaft, and she listened to the absolute silence of 2 feet of limestone and 4 feet of earth, and she slept the first full night of sleep she had slept in 11 months. She began the tunnel on the 16th of March, and she finished it on the 9th of April. 24 days. She worked from first light until her arms would not swing the pick any longer, and then she rested for an hour, and then she swung it again. The south face of the hill was the natural starting point because the earth cover was thinnest there, no more than 2 feet above the cistern wall at floor level, and the grade of the hillside allowed her to cut the tunnel at a slight upward angle from the surface so that any water that entered would drain outward by gravity rather than pooling inside. She cut through earth first. Red Kentucky clay mixed with broken shale and the roots of the wild grass that covered the hillside. The pick broke the clay loose in chunks the size of a man's fist, and she shoveled the chunks into a canvas tarp and dragged the tarp outside and dumped the load on the hillside below the entrance. She moved perhaps 900 pounds of earth per day. Her shoulders seized on the fourth day, and she could not raise her arms above her head for 2 days after that, and she worked through it by swinging the pick from a lower position, angling the blows upward into the clay rather than overhead, adapting the motion to what her body could do rather than demanding what it could not. She was 20 years old and she weighed perhaps 115 pounds, and she had been a gardener and a quilter, not a miner. But she had also been a woman who had carried water from the well to the kitchen 3 times a day for 11 months, and who had chopped kindling every morning, and who had scrubbed a plank floor on her hands and knees every Saturday. And the body she had built doing those things was not the body Drusilla had dismissed. It was stronger than it looked, and it learned fast. The earth gave way to stone on the 8th day. She hit the cistern wall at a depth of 5 feet into the hillside. 2 feet of cut limestone and lime mortar laid by Seward 44 years ago, and as sound as the day he had set it. She could hear the hollowness on the other side when she tapped the wall with the handle of the pick, a low boom like tapping the side of an empty barrel. The cistern was right there on the other side of 2 feet of stone that a mason had laid to hold 10,000 gallons of water, and that was now holding nothing but air and silence in a wool blanket on a flagstone floor. She swung the sledgehammer. The first blow did nothing. The limestone was hard and the mortar was good, and the wall had been built to resist the lateral pressure of 9 feet of water pushing outward in all directions, which was a pressure considerably greater than anything a 20-year-old woman with a 12-pound sledgehammer could produce. The second blow did nothing. The third cracked the mortar between 2 blocks at the point of impact, a crack no wider than a hair. And Verity set the sledgehammer down, and she put her face close to the wall, and she looked at the crack, and she could feel the faintest movement of warm air coming through it from the chamber on the other side. She swung the sledgehammer for 6 hours on the 8th day and broke through 3 inches of stone. She swung it for 8 hours on the 9th day and broke through another 8 inches. By the 11th day, she had punched a hole through the full 2 feet of wall, a hole the size of her fist, and the warm air of the cistern poured through it like breath, and she could see through the hole into the chamber, the disk of pale light on the flagstone floor, the curve of the corbel dome, the wool blanket spread in the center of the room. She spent the next 13 days widening the hole into a passage 3 feet wide and 4 feet tall, knocking out the limestone blocks one by one with the sledgehammer, and the pick stacking them neatly inside the tunnel for later use until on the afternoon of the 9th of April, she knocked out the last block and stepped through the wall and stood inside the cistern at floor level for the first time without having climbed down a rope. She built the door that same week. She framed it from cedar planks she had split from a dead cedar on the hillside above the cistern, using the nails Obadiah had left her and a borrowed hatchet. The frame was tight against the stone-lined tunnel walls, and she covered it with a double layer of deerskin she had traded for with a boy from the Whitlock farm, 3 miles east, who had shot 2 deer in February and had more hides than his mother could use. The door hung on leather hinges cut from the same hides. It swung inward into the tunnel, and when it was closed, it sealed the passage against wind and rain and the smell of the surface world, and when it was opened, the tunnel became a light shaft. The door faced south. The sun entered the horizontal passage from the south and traveled the 5-foot length of the tunnel and emerged into the cistern in a column of warm golden light that reached the opposite wall and lit the circular room with a glow that did not flicker and did not shift and did not go out until the sun moved past the angle of the opening in the late afternoon. She stood in that light on the first evening the door was finished. She stood in the center of the cistern with the golden column pouring through the tunnel and striking the north wall behind her, and she turned slowly and she saw what the room had become. The flagstone floor scrubbed clean with creek water and sand level and dry. The rush mat she had woven from creek bank rushes laid across the center in a double thickness. The walls rising around her in their perfect circle, the limestone smoothed the mortar tight, the dome above diminishing in its 16 courses to the capstone, the lantern on the shelf she had built from a salvaged plank, the sewing basket beside it, the Bible on its own shelf, the one Drusilla had tried to keep, the wool blanket folded on the sleeping platform she had built against the east wall from cedar poles, and rope raised 8 inches off the flagstone floor, topped with a mattress of dried grass that she would cover in time with a quilt of her own making. The cast iron pot hanging from a spike driven into the mortar joint above the hearth she had built against the north wall. The hearth was a small stone platform with a fireback of flat limestone and a smoke channel that ran up the interior wall and into the horizontal tunnel where the draft from the south-facing door drew the smoke outward and away from the living space. The draft was strong. The temperature difference between the warm cistern interior and the cooler tunnel created a natural pull that cleared the smoke within seconds of lighting. The stone walls absorbed the heat of the fire and radiated it back into the circular room for hours after the flames had died. She burned 3 pounds of wood on the first evening, and the interior temperature rose from 52 to 61 degrees and held there until morning. She had a home. She had built it in 24 days out of a hole in the ground that the Marlowe family had abandoned 12 years ago, and it was warmer than the farmhouse 400 yards downhill, and it was quieter than any room she had ever been in, and it was hers. She owed nothing for it. She owed no one for it. She did not have to cook for it at 4 in the morning or scrub its floor at 10 at night or sit in its front room with her hands folded while a woman twice her age explained to her the specific dimensions of her failure as a wife. She could sit in her own room in her own silence with her own Bible on her own shelf, and she could do what she had been put on this earth to do, which was to make things with her hands that were beautiful enough to be worth paying for. The quilting was her trade. She had learned it from her mother in Metcalfe County, beginning at 7 years old with a needle that was too large for her fingers, and a scrap of cotton that she stitched and tore out and stitched again until the stitches were as small and even as her mother demanded. By the time she was 12, she could piece a 9-patch block in an hour. By the time she was 15, she had moved beyond piecing into a applique, the art of cutting shapes from fabric and stitching them onto a background cloth with threads so fine it was nearly invisible, creating flowers and vines and leaves and birds that lay flat against the fabric as if they had grown there. By the time she married Alden Marlowe at 19, she had completed 11 quilts, 4 of which had been sold at the county fair in Edmonton for prices that made the other quilters in the county stop talking when she walked past their tables. She set up the quilting frame near the tunnel entrance on the second week of April. The frame was 4 cedar poles lashed at the corners with rope. The quilt stretched taut between them, the whole apparatus tilted at an angle that put the working surface at the height of her seated eye. The south-facing tunnel admitted its column of golden light directly onto the frame for 6 hours a day in winter and 8 hours in summer, and the light was steady and warm and did not flicker like candlelight and did not shift like window light, and she could sew for hours without the eye strain that had plagued her in the drafty front room of the Marlowe farmhouse, where the afternoon sun came through the windows in moving bars that forced her to shift her chair 3 times between noon and dusk. The first commission came from Dorcas Grimes. Dorcas was Obadiah's wife, 68 years old, a woman built like a fence post who had raised 4 children and buried 2, and who spoke her mind the way a mule kicks without warning and without apology. Dorcas had heard from the women at the Baptist church at Turkey Creek that the young Marlowe woman was living in the old cistern on the hill behind the Marlowe orchard, and Dorcas had not believed it. And Dorcas had walked up the hill on a Tuesday morning in the 3rd week of April, and had ducked through the deerskin door, and had stood in the tunnel and had looked into the cistern, and had not spoken for perhaps 30 seconds, which was the longest silence Dorcas Grimes had produced in the living memory of Barron County. Then Dorcas had walked into the cistern. She had looked at the dome. She had looked at the hearth. She had looked at the quilting frame set up in the column of golden light. She had looked at the half-finished quilt stretched on the frame and a applique pattern of dogwood blossoms and wild grapevines on a field of cream-colored muslin, the stitches so fine that Dorcas had to bend close to see them. Dorcas had straightened up from the quilt, and she had looked at Verity with an expression that Verity would remember for the rest of her life, the expression of a woman who has just realized that she has been underestimating someone. Dorcas had said, "I want one like that. Dogwood and grape, queen size. I will pay whatever you ask." Verity said $12. Dorcas said, "Done." It was the first money Verity earned in the cistern. She finished the quilt in 6 weeks, working in the golden light of the tunnel 6 hours a day, and when Dorcas came to collect it, she held the quilt up to the light, the way a woman holds a piece of lace up to a window, and the dogwood petals lay flat against the muslin, as if they had been pressed there by God, and the grapevines curled and twisted with a life that seemed to move in the light. And Dorcas folded the quilt over her arm, and she walked down the hill, and she told every woman she met on the way home that the girl in the cistern was the finest quilter in Barron County, and possibly the finest quilter in Kentucky, and that her price was $12 and that she was worth 20. The orders came. They came from the Baptist women at Turkey Creek. They came from the Methodist women at Mary Oaks. They came from the farm wives along the Glasgow Road who had heard from Dorcas, or from the women who had heard from Dorcas, and within 6 weeks Verity had a waiting list of 4 quilts and a tin box under her sleeping platform with $36 in it, more money than she had held in her hand at one time in her life. By May, she had bought provisions: cornmeal and salt pork and dried beans and coffee and a pound of white sugar that she kept in a jar on the provision shelf, and allowed herself 1 spoonful per day in her coffee, because a woman who lives in a stone room under a hill is entitled to 1 small luxury per day, and sugar was hers. By July, she had enough saved for the goat. The goat was a young Nubian doe, dark brown with cream-colored ears, bought from a farmer near Glasgow for $4. Verity led the doe down the tunnel on a rope halter, and the doe resisted at first, planting her hooves at the entrance and pulling back against the rope with the particular stubbornness that goats reserve for situations they find beneath their dignity. But when the doe stepped through the deerskin door and entered the tunnel and felt the cool, steady air of the underground on her face, she stopped pulling. She walked the length of the tunnel without resistance. She stepped through the opening into the cistern, and she stood on the flagstone floor, and she looked around the circular room with the calm appraisal of an animal that has found a place it understands. Verity built a pen against the west wall of the cistern. She used the cistern wall as one side and dry stacked limestone blocks from the tunnel excavation for the other 3, creating an enclosure 4 feet by 6 feet with a floor of loose straw laid on the flagstone. The doe adapted within days. The constant temperature and the absence of wind and rain and flies suited the animal. And the stable climate meant stable metabolism, and the doe gave a quart and a half of milk daily through the summer and did not drop below a quart even in the coldest weeks of the winter that followed. Dorcas Grimes taught Verity to make cheese. Dorcas came up the hill on a Wednesday afternoon with a muslin cloth and a bottle of rennet and the particular patience of a woman who has been making cheese since before Verity was born, and who shared the knowledge freely because Dorcas believed that knowledge was like bread. It went stale if you did not pass it around. By August, Verity was pressing small wheels of hard cheese in a mold Obadiah had carved from a block of walnut, and the cheese aged in the cool air of the cistern at a steady rate that produced after 60 days a sharp white cheese that Dorcas declared was better than anything she had tasted in Barron County, though Dorcas said this privately to Obadiah because she was not prepared to make that claim publicly when her own cheese was still sitting on her own shelf. Drusilla Marlowe came to the cistern on the 14th of April 1 month and 1 day after she had told Verity to leave. She came because the quilting circle at the Baptist church had told her that her former daughter-in-law was living in the old cistern on her own property, and Drusilla did not believe it, and even if she had believed it, she would have come anyway because Drusilla Marlowe was a woman who could not tolerate the existence of a situation she had not authorized. Verity heard the footsteps in the tunnel before she saw the figure. Heavy footsteps, the kind made by a woman who walks as if the ground has personally offended her. Verity was sitting at the quilting frame. She did not stand. She did not turn. She continued stitching, and she waited. Drusilla emerged from the tunnel into the cistern. She stood at the edge of the flagstone floor. She looked at the room, the dome overhead, the hearth against the north wall with its small fire burning, the sleeping platform with its grass mattress and wool blanket, the quilting frame in the golden light, the provision shelf with its jars and sacks, the goat pen against the west wall, the doe standing calmly in her straw, chewing, the 3 finished quilts hanging from iron spikes driven into the mortar joints of the walls, each one more intricate than anything Drusilla had ever sewn. Drusilla looked at all of it, then she spoke. She said, "You are living on Marlowe land. This cistern is on Marlowe property. You have no right to be here. I want you gone by the end of the week." Verity set down her needle. She stood. She walked to the shelf above the sleeping platform. She took down a folded piece of paper that she had been carrying in her canvas bag since the day she left Metcalfe County for her wedding, a piece of paper her mother had given her on the morning of her departure, with the instruction that she keep it where no one would find it and read it if she ever needed to know where she stood. The paper was a copy of a promissory note dated the 12th of September, 1841. The note recorded a loan of $14 from a blacksmith named Hollis Crew, who was Verity's grandfather on her mother's side, to a mason named Seward for the completion of a cistern on the Marlowe property in Barron County. The loan had been secured by a written agreement witnessed by the county clerk at Glasgow, granting Hollis Crew and his descendants perpetual right of access and habitation to the cistern and the quarter-acre of land surrounding it, in consideration of the fact that without Crew's $14, the cistern would not have been built and the Marlowe family would not have had water. Verity unfolded the paper. She held it out to Drusilla. Drusilla took the paper. She read it. She read it again. She looked at the signature at the bottom of the note, the signature of the county clerk at Glasgow in 1841, and at the mark of Seward the mason, who could not write his name and had signed with an X beside the letter S that was his mark. She looked at the date. She looked at the terms. She looked at the word perpetual. She set the paper back in Verity's hand. She did not speak. She turned. She walked back through the tunnel. She ducked through the deerskin door. She walked down the hill toward the farmhouse. She did not come back. She did not send Cyrus. She did not send Alden. She did not send a lawyer from Glasgow because sending a lawyer would have required explaining to a man of the law that the Marlowe family's water source for 32 years had been built with money borrowed from a blacksmith whose granddaughter the Marlowes had just thrown out of their house, and Drusilla was not prepared to explain that to anyone. Verity stood in the cistern with the paper in her hand. She folded it. She put it back on the shelf. She sat down at the quilting frame. She picked up her needle. She stitched for 3 hours in the golden light without stopping, and her hands did not shake once. Summer came to Barron County, and the cistern proved what Seward had built it to do, which was hold temperature. On the 15th of June, with the surface air at 90 degrees, the cistern interior read 62. On the 4th of July, with the surface at 95, the interior reads 63. The 2 feet of stone and the 4 feet of earth above absorbed the heat of the sun and held it at a distance the way a moat holds an army at a distance, not by fighting it, but by being too wide and too deep to cross. The flagstone floor stayed cool. The dome stayed cool. The golden light of the tunnel still entered warm in the morning and cool in the afternoon, and the goat gave her milk in a pen that never went above 65 degrees, and the cheese aged on its shelf in air that did not change from 1 week to the next. The quilts came off the frame at a pace of one every 5 to 6 weeks. Applique work. Flowers and vines in geometric patterns, stitched in thread, so fine and so even, that the women who received them held them up to the light and marveled at the precision, which was the precision of a woman who had nothing to do with her evenings except sew, and nothing to distract her except the sound of fire on stone, and the deep underground quiet that made concentration not a discipline, but a gift. By August, Verity had completed 7 quilts and had earned $84. She had expanded the sleeping platform. She had built a proper table from salvaged lumber planks, pulled from a collapsed fence on the back of the Marlowe property, and carried up the hill one at a time and assembled in the cistern with pegs and a borrowed auger. She had built a cedar stool, a second shelf for provisions, a mirror on the wall cracked down the center, salvaged from the farmhouse trash pile where Drusilla had thrown it because Drusilla did not keep broken things. Verity kept it because a cracked mirror shows the same face as a whole one. In September, Jedediah Marlowe came home from Louisville. Jedediah was Alden's younger brother. He was 28 years old, 3 inches taller than Alden, broader in the face, quicker in the eye, and possessed of the particular energy of a man who has spent 5 years in a city learning things that most men in Barron County had not learned, and who intended to make use of the difference. He had left the farm at 23 after a dispute with Cyrus over the management of the tobacco crop, and he had gone to Louisville, and what he had done there was a matter of occasional speculation in the settlement, but no one knew for certain except that he had returned wearing a coat that fit him and shoes that were new and a watch chain across his vest that was not gold but was close enough to gold to suggest that wherever the money had come from, there had been enough of it. He arrived at the Marlowe farm on the 7th of September. He stayed 3 days, and on the 3rd day he walked up the hill behind the orchard, and he stood at the tunnel entrance, and he called into the passage, and Verity came to the door. She had never met Jedediah. He had left the farm 2 years before she married Alden. She knew him only from what Alden had said, which was very little, because Alden said very little about anything that required him to hold an opinion about another person. She stood at the deerskin door, and she looked at the man standing on the hillside in his Louisville coat and his not-quite-gold watch chain, and she waited. He was polite. He was more than polite. He was charming in the particular way that a man is charming when he wants something and has learned in a city how to arrange his face and his voice so that the wanting does not show, until the other person has already agreed to the first three things he has asked for. He said he had heard about her remarkable home. He said he had heard about her quilts, which were the talk of the county. He said he had heard about the cistern and its properties, the constant temperature, the natural ventilation, the stone construction, and he said he was deeply impressed. He said he had a proposal. He said the cistern was, in his estimation, a curiosity of significant commercial value. He said he had seen in Louisville exhibitions of natural wonders and architectural oddities that drew paying crowds by the hundred. He said a stone chamber underground built in 1841, perfectly preserved, inhabited by a quilting woman who had been cast out by her own family and had made a life beneath the earth, was precisely the kind of story that would sell tickets. He said he proposed a partnership. He would bring the crowds. She would show the cistern. They would split the proceeds equally, 50 cents per visitor, 10 visitors a day, $5 a day, $35 a week. More money than her quilts would ever bring. Verity listened to the proposal. She did not interrupt. She did not nod. She did not ask questions. When Jedediah had finished, she was quiet for perhaps 10 seconds, long enough for Jedediah's smile to begin to lose its certainty. She said, "Mr. Marlowe, I am not a curiosity. This is not an exhibition. This is my home. I do not wish to be looked at for 50 cents by strangers from Louisville or anywhere else. I wish to be left alone to do my work. I thank you for your interest, and I decline your proposal." Jedediah adjusted his coat. He tilted his head. He said he understood her feelings and he respected them, and he hoped she would think it over because the offer was generous, and opportunities of this kind did not come often to a woman in her situation. Verity said, "My situation is that I am standing in my own doorway, declining a proposal I did not ask for. I believe that is clear enough. Good day, Mr. Marlowe." She stepped back through the deerskin door. She let it fall closed. She walked through the tunnel into the cistern, and she sat down at the quilting frame, and she picked up her needle. She could hear Jedediah standing on the hillside for another half-minute before his footsteps moved down the slope. The winter of 1885 to 1886 arrived in December, with the particular cruelty of a Kentucky winter that has decided to be remembered. Single digits on the surface, the ground freezing to 8 inches, the wind cutting across the hilltop above the cistern with a sound like tearing cloth. Inside the cistern, the temperature held at 54 degrees. She burned 5 pounds of wood per evening, a fire so small it would not have warmed a bog in a conventional cabin. But the 2-foot stone walls and the corbelled dome and the 4 feet of earth above held the heat the way they had once held water. Absolutely, without leaking, without losing, without any gap or seam through which the precious warmth could escape. The Marlowe farmhouse 400 yards downhill burned 35 pounds of wood per day through the same cold and maintained a temperature of 38 degrees on the worst nights. Cyrus Marlowe spent the winter hauling wood and feeding the fireplace and complaining about the cold that found every gap in the clapboard walls. And he did not know, or chose not to know, that the girl his wife had thrown out was living 400 yards uphill in a room that was 16 degrees warmer and burned a seventh of the fuel. On the night of the 24th of December, 1885, the wind came out of the north at a speed that bent the trees on the ridge above the cistern to angles that would have seemed impossible in daylight. The temperature dropped to 4 degrees above zero. The ground was frozen so deep that the fence posts along the road cracked and split in the night with sounds like pistol shots. The Marlowe cattle huddled in the barn, and Cyrus and Drusilla and Alden sat by the fireplace in coats and scarves, feeding the fire every 20 minutes. Verity sat in the cistern at 54 degrees with a quilt on her lap and a cup of coffee in her hand, and the goat asleep in its pen, and the fire burning at 3 pounds, and she was as warm as she had been on any evening since April. At 9 in the evening, she heard the sound. It came through the earth above her, muffled by 2 feet of stone and 4 feet of frozen ground, but it came through because it was not an ordinary sound. It was a crack, and then a crash, and then a scream, and the scream was the high, thin scream of a child, and it cut through the stone the way a knife cuts through cloth, because some sounds are too sharp for any wall to stop. She was at the tunnel door in 4 seconds. She pushed through the deerskin, and she stood on the hillside in 4-degree air with the wind hitting her face like a slap, and she looked down the south face of the hill toward the road. She saw the lantern first, a single yellow point of light moving along the road from the east, bobbing with the gait of a running man. Then she heard the voice, a man's voice, hoarse, calling out words she could not make out against the wind. Then she heard the child again, and this time the child was not screaming, but crying. The weak, exhausted crying of a child who has been cold for a long time and is beginning to stop being able to cry. She ran down the hill. She ran in her quilting shoes, which were thin-soled and gave no traction on the frozen grass, and she fell twice and got up both times without stopping. She reached the road as the man with the lantern came around the bend. His name was Fenwick Whitlock. He was 34 years old. He was carrying 2 children, his son, a boy of 7 named Caleb, on his left arm, his daughter, a girl of 3 named Ruth, on his right. His wife Lorna was behind him on the road carrying the infant, a boy of 9 months wrapped in a horse blanket. Fenwick was in his shirt sleeves. He had given his coat to his wife. His face was white. The boy on his left arm was not moving. The Whitlock farmhouse was 3 miles to the east. The roof had collapsed at 8 in the evening, the center beam cracking under the weight of ice that had accumulated along the ridgeline during the day. The roof had fallen into the front room where the family was sitting. Lorna had been hit by a falling rafter, but had crawled free. Fenwick had pulled the children out through the kitchen door. They had been walking toward the Marlowe farm for an hour because the Marlowe farm was the nearest dwelling, and Fenwick had been calling out for the last quarter-mile, but no one in the farmhouse had heard him because the farmhouse windows were shuttered against the cold and the wind was blowing the wrong direction. Verity had heard him because sound travels through frozen earth in ways that air does not carry it, and because the open capstone of the cistern's ventilation shaft acted as a funnel, catching the sounds of the hillside and channeling them down through the stone column into the chamber below, and because Verity had been sitting in the silence of 2 feet of stone and 4 feet of earth, where a scream from outside fell on her ears the way a stone falls on still water. She took the boy from Fenwick's arm. The boy was limp. His skin was gray. His eyes were closed. She did not wait. She carried him up the hill. She kicked the deerskin door open with her foot. She carried him through the tunnel. She laid him on the flagstone floor beside the hearth. The fire was still burning. The cistern was still at 54 degrees. She pulled the quilt from her sleeping platform, and she wrapped the boy in it. She put her hand on his chest. She could feel his heart. It was slow and weak, and it was beating with the irregular rhythm of a body that has spent too long in the cold and is beginning to forget how to do the thing that keeps it alive. She stoked the fire. She added wood. She added more wood than she had burned in any single evening since April, and the stone walls drank the heat and held it, and the room climbed to 60, then 62, then 65. She held the boy against her chest with the quilt around both of them, and she pressed her own warmth into him through the fabric, and she rocked him the way a mother rocks a child, which she had never done because she had never had a child, But she did it now because the motion was in her body, whether she had practiced it or not. The way the motion of swimming is in the body of a child who has never been in water. Some things the body knows without being taught. Fenwick came through the tunnel with his wife and the two other children. Lorna Whitlock collapsed on the flagstone floor beside the hearth. The infant was crying, which was good, because a crying infant is a breathing infant. The 3-year-old girl stood just inside the tunnel and did not move her eyes wide, her lips blue, her small hands curled into fists inside the sleeves of her nightgown. Verity gave the girl a cup of warm milk from the goat. She warmed the milk on the hearth in the cast iron pot, and she put a pinch of sugar in it from the jar on the shelf, and she held the cup to the girl's mouth. And the girl drank slowly at first, and then with a hunger that was not hunger, but the body remembering what warmth tasted like. She gave Lorna a cup of the same milk. She gave Fenwick a cup of coffee. She did not give Fenwick warm milk because Fenwick was a grown man, and a cup of strong coffee would do more for a grown man's spirits than warm milk, and she was right. At 10 o'clock, the boy opened his eyes. He looked up at the Corbel dome. He looked at the fire. He looked at Verity holding him. He said, "Where are we?" Verity said, "You are in my house." The boy said, "It is warm." Verity said, "Yes." The boy closed his eyes again and slept, and his breathing was slow and even, and his color was coming back, and Lorna Whitlock put her hands over her face and wept the way a mother weeps when the worst thing she has imagined does not happen, which is a weeping that has no sound because all of the sound was used up in the imagining. The Whitlock family stayed 3 days. They slept on the flagstone floor on quilts Verity pulled from the walls. The 3 finished quilts that had been hanging from the iron spikes, the quilts that were worth $12 each, and that Verity laid on the stone without hesitation. Because quilts are for keeping people warm, and the people on her floor were cold. Fenwick walked to the Marlowe farmhouse the next morning and told Cyrus what had happened, and Cyrus sent a wagon, and the wagon brought blankets and food and a message from Drusilla that was not recorded, but that Fenwick repeated to Verity in a tone of mild bewilderment, which was that Drusilla had said she has always been a strange girl. Verity did not respond to the message. The county heard the story within a week. The quilting women at Turkey Creek heard it first. The Methodist women at Merry Oaks heard it second. The farmers along the Glasgow Road heard it third. By the new year, every family in Barron County knew that the young Marlowe woman who had been put out of her husband's house for not bearing a child had saved the Whitlock boy's life on Christmas night in a stone room underground that was warmer than any house in the county, and they knew it because Fenwick Whitlock told the story at every gathering he attended for the next 6 months, and he told it the same way every time. And the part he always lingered on was the part about the warm milk with the sugar in it, and the way Verity had held his son against her chest and rocked him, and the way the boy had opened his eyes and said, "It is warm," and the way Verity had said yes. The settlement stopped discussing whether Verity Marlowe had been right to stay in the cistern. The settlement began discussing instead what was owed to her. Women who had nodded along with Drusilla's judgment in March now found reason to send baskets of eggs and jars of preserves up the hill delivered quietly without occasion. Men who had agreed with Cyrus that the girl was odd now tipped their hats when they passed her on the road to town. On the 4th of January, 1886, 11 days after the night of the Whitlock fire, a sound came through the tunnel at dusk. Not a knock, not a call, a sound like a heavy object being set down on the frozen grass outside the deerskin door. Verity put down her needle. She walked through the tunnel. She opened the door. No one was there. The hillside was empty in the January twilight. But at the base of the tunnel entrance, just outside the deerskin door, a wooden box sat on the frozen ground. A small box, perhaps the size of a bread loaf made of walnut with a hinged lid and a brass latch. She picked it up. She carried it inside. She set it on the table. She opened the lid. Inside the box was a notebook. A small leather-bound notebook, the kind a woman might keep for copying recipes or pressing flowers. She recognized it. It was hers. She had left it in the bedroom drawer at the Marlowe farmhouse on the morning of the 15th of March because she had been packing in a hurry, and because she had not thought of it, and because she had not on that morning been thinking about the things she had written in it during the early months of her marriage. She opened the notebook. She turned the pages. She had written in it on the nights when Alden was asleep, sitting up in the bed with its stub of pencil, writing by the light of the candle on the nightstand. She had written about the farm. She had written about the orchard. She had written about the quilt she wanted to make. And she had written on 3 pages near the middle of the book about the child she wanted to have. She had written about what she would name it and how she would teach it to sew and what color quilt she would make for its cradle. And she had written these things in the small, private hand of a woman who did not expect anyone to read them. Someone had read them. Someone had opened the drawer. Someone had found the notebook. Someone had read the 3 pages about the child, and someone had put the notebook in a walnut box with a brass latch, and someone had carried it up the hill to the cistern and had set it at the door and had walked away without knocking. She knew who had brought it. She knew because there was only one person in the Marlowe farmhouse who knew which drawer the notebook was in, and that person was the same person who had lain beside her for 11 months pretending to sleep. She closed the notebook. She put it back in the box. She closed the lid. She set the box on the shelf beside the Bible. She sat down at the quilting frame. She looked at the deerskin door for a long time. Then she picked up her needle and she went back to work. Jedediah Marlowe did not leave Barron County after Verity declined his proposal. He stayed through the autumn and into the winter, taking a room above the dry goods store in Glasgow, and he was seen in the settlement at intervals that followed no pattern anyone could discern. He was at Durant's store on a Tuesday. He was at the Baptist church on a Sunday, though no one in the settlement could recall having seen him in a church before. He was at the blacksmith's shop in Mary Oaks on a Thursday afternoon, talking to the smith about the price of iron spikes and the depth of limestone in the ridges east of the Marlowe property. He asked questions the way a man asks questions when he does not want the answers to be remembered casually, as if the asking were an accident of conversation and not the purpose of it. He had been in Louisville for 5 years. What he had done there was not entirely clear to the people of Barron County, but what he had learned there was visible to anyone who watched him carefully, and Verity watched him carefully because she had heard in his voice on the September afternoon when he stood at her tunnel door with his not quite gold watch chain and his proposal the particular pitch of a man who has been told no and who does not intend to accept it. She had heard that pitch before. She had heard it in Drusilla's voice on the night of the 14th of March. It was the pitch of a person who has already decided what is going to happen and who regards the other person's refusal as a delay rather than an answer. The winter passed. The cistern held its 54 degrees. Verity quilted. She earned. She made cheese. She sold 3 wheels at Durant's store in the first week of January and 4 more in February. She walked the creek road to Glasgow on the first Saturday of each month, and she sold quilts and cheese and butter at the market stall that Dorcas Grimes had helped her arrange, and she walked home with money in her pocket and provisions in her bag and the particular steadiness of a woman who has discovered that she can feed herself. On the night of the 12th of March, 1886, 3 days before the anniversary of her departure from the Marlowe farmhouse, she was asleep on her sleeping platform in the cistern, with the fire burned down to coals and the goat asleep in its pen, and the dome above her dark, except for the faint gray disk of starlight at the top of the ventilation shaft. She woke because the stone spoke to her. She had learned in 11 months underground to hear the stone the way a sailor hears the hull of his ship, as a medium through which vibrations travel and are translated by the listening body into information about what is happening on the other side. The stone said something was wrong. The stone said there was movement above her that did not belong to the wind or the settling of the earth or the passage of an animal across the surface. The stone said someone was digging. She lay still. She listened. The sound was faint and irregular. The sound of metal striking earth, muffled by 4 feet of packed clay, but transmitted through the stone dome with a low resonance that was unmistakable to a woman who had spent 24 days digging through earth and stone herself, and who knew exactly what a pick sounded like when it hit limestone. She got up. She moved to the center of the chamber. She stood directly beneath the capstone, and she looked up at the dome. The 16th course, the course nearest the capstone, was vibrating. She could not see the vibration, but she could feel it through her feet, transmitted down through the dome and the walls and into the flagstone floor, a tremor so fine that she might have dismissed it as imagination if she had not known her own house the way she knew her own body. Someone was digging into the dome from above. Someone was trying to break through 4 feet of earth and 2 feet of corbelled limestone from the surface. Someone was trying to collapse the roof of her home while she slept beneath it. She did not panic. She walked to the tunnel. She walked the 5-foot passage to the deerskin door. She pushed the door open an inch, and she looked out into the night. The hillside was dark. The moon had set an hour before. She could see nothing on the slope above her, but she could hear what the stone had told her she would hear. The sound of 2 men working with picks in the frozen earth above the Cistern dome. The sound was coming from a point approximately 6 feet east of the ventilation shaft, which was the thinnest point of the earth cover on the upper face of the hill, where the 4 feet of packed clay thinned to perhaps 3 feet at the edge of the dome's curvature. She closed the door. She went back inside. She dressed. She put on Alden's old coat, which she had taken from the barn on the morning of the 15th of March, because it had been hanging on a nail behind the feed bins, and no one had claimed it, and she had needed a coat. She went back to the tunnel. She waited. The digging continued for perhaps another hour. She heard the picks hit stone. She heard the stone resist. She heard the men above her working at the dome, the way 2 men work at a wall they expect to give way with increasing force and decreasing patience. And she heard the dome do what Seward had built it to do, which was hold. The corbelled dome was not a flat roof, it was an arch. An arch distributes force laterally through its curved structure, transferring the weight of any impact from the point of contact to the entire circumference of the dome, and from the circumference to the walls, and from the walls to the foundation, and from the foundation to the earth. A pick striking the crown of an arch does not break the arch. It strikes a single stone. The stone absorbs the blow and passes the force to the stones on either side, and the stones on either side pass it to the stones on either side of them. And by the time the force reaches the base of the dome, it has been divided among so many stones that no single stone bears more than a fraction of the original impact. The men above her did not know this. They knew that they had been told by a man in a Louisville coat that the cistern roof was old stone, and that old stone could be broken with a pick, and that the woman inside would have no warning and no way out except the tunnel on the south face, and that if the roof came down in the night, she would be buried, and the matter would be settled, and the land would revert to the Marlowe family, and the Marlowe family would sell it to the man in the Louisville coat for whatever he offered. The men dug for an hour. They broke through the earth cover. They reached the stone. They struck the stone with their picks for perhaps 20 minutes. They dislodged a single block from the 15th course of the bay, a block the size of a man's head, which fell 9 feet and struck the flagstone floor of the cistern with a sound like a cannon shot, and shattered into 3 pieces that scattered across the floor and came to rest against the base of the west wall. The dome held. The capstone held. The other 15 courses held. Seward's work held because Seward had built it to hold 10,000 gallons of water, pressing outward in all directions, and 2 men with picks pressing inward from one direction were not 10,000 gallons of water. The men stopped. She heard them speaking above her, their voices muffled by the remaining stone, the words indistinct but the tone clear. The tone of men who have discovered that the job they were hired to do is harder than the man who hired them said it would be. She heard them gather their tools. She heard them walk across the surface of the dome and down the slope of the hill toward the east, toward the road away from the Marlowe farm, and away from the Grimes place in the direction of Glasgow. She waited until she could no longer hear their footsteps. She went to the place where the stone block had fallen. She picked up the 3 fragments. She set them aside. She looked up at the hole in the dome, a single block missing from the 15th course, 12 inches wide, 9 inches tall. She could see the raw earth above the hole, and above the earth, a patch of night sky the size of a dinner plate. The dome around the hole was intact. The mortar joints on either side of the missing block were cracked but holding. The 14th course and the 16th course were undamaged. She picked up the fallen pieces. She climbed the rope through the ventilation shaft. She came out onto the surface. She walked to the excavation above the dome. The 2 men had dug a pit approximately 4 feet across through the earth cover to the stone, and they had worked at the stone with picks, and they had succeeded in loosening and dropping the single block. The pit was muddy and the edges were rough, and around the rim of the pit in the mud and the churned earth she found what she had climbed up to find: a piece of paper, a small piece torn from the corner of a larger sheet perhaps 3 inches by 2 inches. It had been in the mud at the edge of the pit, probably dropped from a coat pocket when one of the men bent down to examine the stone. The paper was damp but legible. On one side, in a hand she did not recognize, was written a set of directions. From Glasgow Road, take the farm track north past the second gate and up the hill behind the old orchard to the stone shaft. The shaft marks the center of the dome. Dig 6 feet east of the shaft where the earth is thinnest. On the other side of the paper, in a different hand, a hand that was rounder and more practiced, was written a single word in a set of initials. The word was agreed. The initials were J.M. She stood on the hillside in the dark with the piece of paper in her hand. J.M. Jedediah Marlowe. The directions had been written for the 2 men. The agreement had been signed by the man who had hired them. The paper was not a legal document. It was not a contract. It was a scrap torn from a larger communication that she would never see and that had probably been destroyed. But the initials were enough. The initials told her what she needed to know, and they told her something else as well, which was that Jedediah Marlowe was not a careful man. A careful man does not write his initials on instructions he gives to men he has hired to collapse a roof on a sleeping woman. A careful man burns the instructions. Jedediah had not burned them because Jedediah was not, despite the Louisville coat and the watch chain, a man who thought about consequences. He was a man who thought about opportunities, and he had confused the two, and the confusion had left his initials on a piece of paper in the mud beside the hole his men had failed to dig. She put the paper in her coat pocket. She went back down into the cistern through the ventilation shaft. She mixed mortar from the lime she kept in a tin beside the hearth. She climbed back up to the surface with the mortar in a bucket and the 3 fragments of the fallen block wrapped in cloth. She fitted the fragments back into the hole in the dome. They did not fit perfectly because stone that has been shattered does not return to its original shape. But she packed the gaps with mortar, and she pressed the fragments into place, and she smoothed the mortar with a flat stone, and she let it set. She filled the excavation pit with the earth the men had dug out, tamping it down with the flat of the shovel. By dawn, the surface of the hill looked nearly as it had looked the day before, nearly. A person who had not known the ground would not have seen the disturbance. A person who had known the ground well would have seen that the earth had been turned and repacked. She did not go to the county sheriff. She did not go to Glasgow. She did not go to the Grimes place. She waited until the sun was fully up, and then she washed her face and pinned her braids and put on the gray wool traveling dress she had been married in, because it was the most formal garment she owned, and what she was about to do required formality. She walked down the hill. She crossed the pasture. She walked through the old orchard. She walked past the barn and the smokehouse and the woodpile and the hen house, and she walked up the front steps of the Marlowe farmhouse, and she opened the front door without knocking because she had lived in this house for 11 months, and she knew the door, and the door knew her. Cyrus Marlowe was at the kitchen table. Drusilla was at the stove. They both turned when the door opened. They saw Verity standing in the front room in her gray wool dress, with her braids pinned, and her face set in an expression that was not anger and was not accusation, but was something older and harder than either of those things, something that belonged to a woman who had been dug at in the night and who had come down the hill not to ask for help, but to deliver a fact. She walked to the kitchen table. She took the piece of paper from her coat pocket. She laid it on the table in front of Cyrus. She smoothed it flat with her palm. Cyrus looked at the paper. He read the directions on one side. He turned it over. He read the word agreed in the initials J.M. He looked up at Verity. Verity said one sentence. She said, "Your son tried to bring the roof down on me while I slept. I do not need the law. I need you to know." She did not wait for an answer. She turned. She walked back through the front room. She opened the door. She closed the door behind her. She walked down the steps and across the yard and through the orchard and up the hill, and she did not look back. Cyrus Marlowe sat at the kitchen table with the piece of paper in front of him for a long time. Drusilla stood at the stove. Neither of them spoke. Cyrus read the paper 3 more times. He folded it. He put it in his shirt pocket. He stood up. He put on his hat. He walked outside. Jedediah was staying at the house that week. He was in the barn oiling a harness he had no use for because Jedediah liked to give the appearance of work without performing any. Cyrus walked into the barn. What was said inside the barn was not heard by anyone except Jedediah, because Cyrus Marlowe was a man who kept his voice low when the thing he was saying was the worst thing he had ever had to say to one of his children. But when Jedediah came out of the barn 20 minutes later, he was carrying his valise and his Louisville coat, and his face was the color of ash, and he walked down the farm track to the Glasgow road without looking at the house and without speaking to his mother, who was standing on the porch watching him go. He did not come back to Barron County. He was heard of once 2 years later in a letter from a cousin in Memphis who said Jedediah was working in a hotel and was not well and was not likely to be well. And the letter did not say what the illness was, and no one in the Marlowe family asked. 2 days after Cyrus sent Jedediah away, Alden Marlowe walked up the hill behind the orchard for the second time. The first time had been the night he left the walnut box with the notebook at the tunnel door. He had come and gone without being seen. This time he came in daylight in the late afternoon of the 14th of March, one day before the first anniversary of the morning Verity had left the farmhouse. He carried a small canvas sack in his right hand. He walked up the hill with the slow, deliberate steps of a man who is not sure he should be walking in this direction, but who has run out of reasons to walk in any other. He reached the tunnel entrance. He stood outside the deerskin door. He did not knock. He did not call. He set the canvas sack on the ground at the base of the door frame. He stood there for perhaps 30 seconds. Then he turned and walked back down the hill. Verity was inside the cistern. She heard him come. She heard him stop. She heard the sound of the sack being set on the ground. She heard him stand. She heard him turn. She heard him go. She did not go to the door. She waited until the sound of his footsteps had faded completely. Then she walked through the tunnel and opened the deerskin door and picked up the canvas sack and brought it inside. The sack contained money. $120 in banknotes folded into a tight square and tied with a piece of twine. There was no note. There was no letter. There was nothing in the sack except the money and the silence of a man who had never learned how to speak when speaking was required, and who had therefore learned to put his silence into objects and leave the objects where they could be found. $120. It was more money than Alden could have saved from his share of the farm's income in the time since Verity had left. She understood without needing to confirm it that it was everything he had. Every dollar he had put aside in the years before their marriage and the months after. The whole of what a quiet man on a Kentucky farm had managed to accumulate by not spending, which was the only financial strategy available to a man who earned little and wanted less. She sat at the table with the money in front of her. She did not count it again. She had counted it once and she knew the amount, and counting it again would not change the amount or the meaning of it. She thought about returning it. She thought about walking down the hill and setting the sack on the front porch of the farmhouse, the way he had set it at her door silently without explanation. She thought about this for perhaps 10 minutes. She did not return it. She did not return it because returning it would have been a cruelty, and Verity Marlowe was not cruel. Returning a man's entire savings to him after he has left them at your door as the only apology he knows how to make is not mercy. It is punishment. It says your apology is not worth accepting. It says your silence, which is the only language you have, is not a language I am willing to hear. And Verity had spent 11 months listening to Alden's silence, and she had learned to hear what was in it, even when what was in it was cowardice and failure, and the particular helplessness of a man who loves a woman but cannot stand between her and his mother. She heard all of that in the $120 on her table, and she did not send it back. She used the money. She walked to Glasgow on the first Saturday of April, and she inquired at the land office about the parcels adjacent to the Cistern property. The quarter-acre surrounding the cistern, which was hers by the terms of the promissory note from 1841, was bordered on 3 sides by Marlowe land and on the 4th by a strip of unimproved timber that belonged to the county and that had never been claimed because the ground was too steep for farming and the timber was too small for logging. She bought the strip. 11 acres of hillside for $60, which was more than the land was worth for any purpose, except the one Verity had in mind, which was to own the ground above her head. She used the remaining $60 to buy lumber and hardware, and a second goat, a young buck, to breed with the doe she already had, and she spent the spring of 1886 expanding. She dug a second tunnel from the cistern's east wall into the hillside, angling it slightly downward so that the air at the far end was cooler than the air in the main chamber. The second tunnel opened into an alcove she excavated from the clay and lined with dry stacked limestone, a room 6 feet square and 5 feet tall, where the temperature held at 48 degrees year-round. Cool enough to keep butter and milk fresh without ice. Cool enough to store root vegetables through the winter without sprouting. Cool enough to age the hard cheese she was now producing in quantity from the milk of 2 goats. The cistern became by the second winter not just a home but a system. A living space connected to a cold pantry, connected to a ventilation shaft, connected to a light tunnel. All of it underground. All of it stone. All of it built on the foundation that a mason named Seward had laid in 1841 for $14 a foundation so well made that 45 years of weather and neglect and 2 men with picks had not been able to damage it beyond the loss of a single block that a 20-year-old woman had repaired with mortar and fragments in the dark. The quilting business grew beyond Barron County. Dorcas Grimes, who had been Verity's first customer and her loudest advocate, had a sister in Bowling Green, who had a friend in Nashville, who had a cousin in Louisville, and the chain of women who knew women carried Verity's reputation outward from the cistern like ripples from a stone dropped in a pond. By the autumn of 1886, she had orders from 3 counties. By the spring of 1887, she had orders from Nashville. By 1888, she had a standing commission from a dry goods merchant in Louisville who sold her quilts for $25 each to women who had never been to Barron County and who did not know that the quilts they were laying on their beds had been stitched in a stone room 9 feet underground by a woman who worked in a column of golden light that entered through a tunnel cut into a hillside. She took in her first apprentice in the spring of 1887, a young widow named Elspeth Combs, 22 years old from a farm near Tompkinsville in Monroe County, whose husband had been killed by a falling tree in January, and who had been sent to Verity by the Methodist circuit rider who had heard the story of the cistern and who believed correctly that Verity would not turn a widow away. Elspeth arrived at the tunnel entrance with a canvas bag, not much different from the one Verity had carried up the hill 2 years before, and Verity showed her the cistern and the quilting frame and the golden light, and Elspeth stayed for 14 months and learned the applique technique and left in the summer of 1888 with enough skill to support herself and enough quilts in her bag to start her own trade. The second apprentice came in the autumn of 1888, a woman named Darcy Pelfrey, 19 years old from Adair County, who had not been widowed but had been abandoned, which was a different kind of loss that produced the same practical result, which was a woman alone with no income and no plan. Darcy stayed 18 months. She was not as fine a stitcher as Elspeth, but she was faster and she had a gift for the geometric patterns that Verity found tedious, and between them they produced quilts at a rate that kept the Louisville merchants supplied in the tin box under the sleeping platform full. The years passed. They passed the way years pass in a settled place, not by events, but by accumulations. The goat herd grew to 4. The cheese production grew to 12 wheels per season. The garden on the south face of the hill, irrigated by a spring seep that Verity had channeled into a clay-lined ditch, produced tomatoes and beans and squash and potatoes through 3 growing seasons. The cistern interior acquired over time the particular character of a place that has been inhabited with care. Shelves on every wall, quilts hanging from iron spikes, herbs drying from the dome in bundles tied with string, the cracked mirror catching the light of the lantern in the evening, the Bible on its shelf, the walnut box with the notebook on its shelf beside the Bible, the smell of wood smoke and goat milk and dried lavender, and the deep mineral smell of the stone itself. The smell of a room that has been lived in for years and that has absorbed the evidence of that living into its walls the way the walls once absorbed water. She taught 12 women in all, They came from 5 counties. Some stayed months, some stayed a year. Each one arrived with some version of the canvas bag and the traveling dress and the particular expression of a woman who has been required to start over and does not yet know how. Each one left with a skill and a small stock of materials and the knowledge that a stone room 9 feet underground can be warmer than a clapboard house and quieter than a church, and that the work done there in the golden light of a south-facing tunnel will be finer than any work done in the noise and distraction of the surface world. Obadiah Grimes died on the 7th of November, 1891. He was 77 years old. He died in his bed in the house he had lived in for 51 years, with Dorcas beside him and the stove burning, and the wind outside doing what the wind does in November in Kentucky, which is everything in its power to remind the living that winter is not a season but a judgment. He had been ill for 3 weeks. Verity had visited him every day of those 3 weeks, walking the 3/4 of a mile from the cistern to the Grimes place in the morning, and sitting beside his bed for an hour and walking home. She did not bring him food or medicine because Dorcas had both. She brought him silence. She sat beside his bed, and she did not speak because Obadiah had spent 7 years not speaking about the things he had done for her, and she honored his silence by matching it. And the two of them sat together in the bedroom of the Grimes house, in a quiet that was not empty but full, the way a well is full even when it holds no water, because the shape itself contains something. The will was read at the Glasgow courthouse on the 20th of November. Obadiah had left the house and the household goods to Dorcas as expected. He had left a small sum of money to each of his surviving children as expected. And he had left the land, all 40 acres of it, to a woman who was not related to him by blood or by marriage, in a bequest that was described in the will in a single line. To Verity Marlowe, the 40 acres known as the Grimes Tract in Barron County, for the reason that she has known how to be silent in the right way. The lawyer who read the will looked up from the page. He looked at Verity, who was sitting in the back of the courtroom in her gray wool dress. He looked at Dorcas, who was sitting in the front row. Dorcas did not turn around. Dorcas did not protest. Dorcas had known about the bequest for 2 years because Obadiah had told her, and Dorcas had agreed because Dorcas understood the same thing Obadiah understood, which was that land should go to the person who will use it and not to the person who is expected to receive it. After the reading, Dorcas walked to the back of the courtroom. She handed Verity a sealed envelope. She said he wrote this the week before he died. He said to give it to you after the will was read and not before. Verity took the envelope. She did not open it in the courtroom. She walked home. She walked the 6 miles from Glasgow to the Cistern in the November cold, and she sat down at her table in the golden light of the late afternoon, and she opened the envelope. The letter was 2 pages long, written in Obadiah's hand, which was the careful, square hand of a man who had been taught to write by a schoolmaster who believed penmanship was a moral virtue. The letter said that Obadiah had worked as a journeyman mason under Seward in 1841. He had been 27 years old. He had mixed the mortar. He had carried the blocks. He had helped lay every course of the Corbel dome. He had set the capstone himself under Seward's direction on the afternoon of the 11th of October, 1841, and Seward had stood back and looked at the finished dome and had said a thing that Obadiah had carried in his memory for 50 years. Seward had said, "This room will hold water for as long as the spring feeds it, and when the spring stops, it will hold whatever comes next, because stone does not forget what it was built to do. It only waits for the right thing to fill it." Obadiah wrote that he had not thought about Seward's words for many years. He had built his own house. He had raised his family. He had grown old. The cistern had gone dry in '73, and he had thought nothing of it because a dry cistern was no concern of his. But on the morning of the 15th of March, 1885, when a young woman with straw-colored braids and a canvas bag had walked up his lane and asked to borrow a sledgehammer he had known. He had known the way a mason knows when a stone is set right, not by measurement, but by feel. He had known that the girl was going to the cistern. He had known that the cistern was going to hold her. And he had known without needing to be told that what Seward had said 50 years ago was true, and that the room had been waiting, and that the right thing had come to fill it. He wrote that he had left the nails and the lantern and the ham at the base of the shaft on the first evening because a man who has built a room does not let a woman sleep in it without light or food or the means to hang her things on the wall. He wrote that he had not spoken of it because speaking of it would have diminished it, and because the girl had not asked for help, and because a man who gives help that has not been asked for must give it silently or not at all. He wrote at the end of the letter a single line. He wrote, "I built that dome with my own hands when I was 27. You are 27 now. The dome is yours. The land is yours. Do with it what Seward would have wanted, which is to say, do with it what you have already been doing. Hold what needs holding. Let go of what does not." Verity folded the letter. She put it in the walnut box beside the notebook. She closed the lid. She sat at the table for a long time. She was 27 years old. She owned 40 acres of land and an 11-acre strip of hillside and a quarter-acre surrounding a cistern that a mason named Seward had built in 1841 for $14, assisted by a young journeyman named Obadiah Grimes, who had carried the blocks and mixed the mortar and set the capstone and remembered every word his master had said, and who had waited 50 years to see the words come true. She had not remarried. She would not remarry. She had not borne a child. She would not bear a child. The 3 pages in the notebook in the walnut box, the pages about the names she would have chosen, and the quilt she would have made for the cradle remained the only record of that particular hope. And she did not read them again after the night Alden left the box at her door. But she had taught 12 women. She had taught them to cut and stitch and piece and applique. She had taught them to work in golden light. She had taught them that a room underground can be warmer than a house above ground, and that the silence of stone is not emptiness but presence. She had taught them without meaning to and without saying so that a woman who has been told she is not enough can build a life that proves the telling wrong, and that the proof does not require an argument or a confrontation or even a word spoken aloud. The proof requires only the work, the quilts on the wall, the cheese on the shelf, the goat in the pen, the fire in the hearth, the golden light in the tunnel, the dome overhead, 16 courses of limestone rising to a capstone, set by a man who built things to last and whose work outlived him by half a century and was still holding. In the spring of 1892, Verity planted apple trees along the south face of the hill. She planted 12 of them, one for each woman she had taught. The trees were small and bare when she set them in the ground, bare root stock from a nursery in Bowling Green, and they looked like nothing more than sticks pushed into the clay. But the spring seep kept the roots moist and the south face caught the sun, and by the 3rd year the trees were bearing, and by the 5th year the south face of the hill was an orchard, a small orchard that bloomed white in April and bore red in September, and that could be seen from the porch of the Marlowe farmhouse, 400 yards downhill, where Drusilla Marlowe stood on autumn mornings and looked up at the hill and saw the apple trees and the smoke from the cistern hearth rising thin and white through the ventilation shaft, and did not speak of what she saw, because there was nothing left to say about the girl in the cistern that had not already been said by the cistern itself. On an evening in October of that year, Verity sat on a cedar stool outside the tunnel entrance on the south face of the hill. The sun was going down behind the ridge to the west. The apple trees were heavy with fruit. The smoke from the hearth was rising through the shaft above her, thin and straight in the still air. The goats were grazing the hillside below the tunnel, their bells making a small, irregular music in the quiet. She held a cup of coffee in both hands. She watched the light change on the hills across the valley. She listened to the sound of the creek in the bottom, and the bells of the goats, and the evening birds, and beneath all of it, the silence of the stone behind her, the silence of a room that held whatever was put into it and did not let go. Some rooms hold water, some rooms hold people, and some rooms, when the water goes and the purpose changes and the right person finds the door, hold something that has no name but that lasts longer than water and weighs more than stone, and that fills the space so completely that the room itself forgets it was ever empty.